What's happening, ladies and gentlemen? Hopping on here to talk about news related to U.S. tariffs on Canada, Mexico, recent news, and what that means for a small business owner. If you're checking this out and you are a small business owner, then there's a probability that you're probably impacted by this. And so I know there's a lot of heated discussion taking shape about this, but I find it fascinating on any side of the spectrum because no matter how you slice it and dice it, like there's some things that are impacting people. And so I got to thinking about, you know, ideas and options for like how to prepare for stuff like this. And sometimes it might feel like you can't really ever prepare for stuff like this that occurs. But nonetheless, I think it's worth talking about because I think there's some things you can do. And I learned a few things years back when I was running, an e-commerce business that required bringing in products from one of these countries. Actually, it's getting slapped with tariffs. And the thing that I was advised about doing was making sure that there was a plan B, like with a another supplier in place because of it. And so at the time, I didn't really think anything big. Like, didn't think it was going to really impact me at all. And there's a good probability that it wouldn't have at that time. But fast forward here about 2 years or less, and I would have been impacted by it tremendously. And so let's talk about it for just a second and see what everybody's thinking about this. I want to pose a few questions, few scenarios, etc. And one of those being the obvious question about, how does temporary tariffs or a pause on tariffs, I should say now, because if you recall, Trump had placed tariffs and then they were put on notice. Canada and Mexico were put on notice. And then they began speaking with each other over what the demands were. And all of a sudden now we have a 30-day pause while negotiations are being made and seeing if people, respond to what was being discussed. So let's kind of rewind the clock a little bit here and speak about what was going down. So we're in February. President Donald Trump announced the imposition of new tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China, specifically 25% on Canada and Mexico, and 10% towards Chinese imports. And the administration was justifying these measures by citing concerns over illegal immigration, the influx of fentanyl into the United States. So in response, you've seen Canada and Mexico declare their intentions to implement retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. goods. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced the 25% tariff on $155 billion worth of American products. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum also indicated plans for retaliatory measures through specific details were pending. That never fully came out, at least from what I was able to find about what that was going to look like. I think they were waiting on discussions to take shape. And economists and industry leaders have expressed concerns that these tariffs could lead to increased costs for American consumers and businesses, potentially fueling inflation and disrupting supply chains. The automotive, consumer electronics, and energy sectors are anticipated to be amongst the most affected. Obviously, a large portion of American automotives are imported from Mexico, and we see other lumber and whatnot from Canada, amongst other things, obviously. So a lot of things going back and forth here. I seen Mexico stating that they were wanting to, curb some of the arms deals and how people were getting access to firearms through the United States, as well as being one of the talking points of the discussion here. But then I seen their tweets. I want to share the tweets of what these were. Okay, because I found it fascinating. It's like, man, Trump was putting pressure on these guys to react, and I know he's been getting a lot of heat because of it. But at the same time, I was like, dang, like these guys knew he wasn't playing around right when it was done. But why did it take so long? Why weren't these guys doing it beforehand? That's a good question I seen floating around too. Like, why wasn't this already being implemented? And why did it take threats of a tariff coming into play in order for these different presidents to move the needle on stuff? I do not know, but they're good questions. So as you can see here in Trudeau's response, and granted, he's getting a lot of heat too because he's due to exit as Canada's leader here pretty soon as well. But it says he had a good call with President Trump, and Canada's implementing their $1.3 billion border plan, reinforcing the border with new choppers, technology, and personnel, enhanced coordination with the American partners, and increased resources to stop the flow of fentanyl. Okay, nearly 10,000 frontline personnel will be working on protecting the border. In addition, Canada is making a new commitment to appoint a fentanyl czar, which will list cartels also as terrorists. I find it fascinating, though. Again, don't want to be too critical of this here, but it's like, man, this thing doesn't happen just overnight. So obviously they were planning for it, but why did it have to take all this in order to get there? On the flip side of the coin here, Claudia Sheinbaum, for those who don't read Spanish, we'll give you the English version here. It says they had a good conversation with President Trump, great respect for the relationship and sovereignty. And here's kind of the details of the agreement. One, Mexico will immediately reinforce the northern border with 10,000 members of the National Guard to prevent drug trafficking into the states, particularly fentanyl. And the United States is committed to working to prevent the trafficking of high-powered weapons to Mexico. So it sounds like both sides are saying, hey, this is a problem. Fentanyl is coming into the United States. It's a problem. They're each sending 10,000 troops from their respective border or from their respective country to the border to patrol that, and that their teams are working on both fronts to do that. So how might this impact, small business owners in the United States? For anybody not wondering what's going on, well, one of the immediate things that you see right off the bat, small businesses that rely on imported goods from Canada, Mexico, or China, it's going to affect their pricing strategies, right? So people that have to import products from another country, they're typically doing it because they're getting a better deal. There's a better price margin from outsourcing it to another country with lower labor costs, lower costs for the price of the goods and the materials, etc. And so there's a pricing advantage that somebody's able to have when they develop these partnerships. But with these tariffs in place, the business owners are the ones going to be paying the difference of that. So it is going to affect pricing strategies in place, which impacts profit margins, of course. Supply chain disruptions, tariffs lead to delays and shortages in the supply chain. And anybody that's been in the retail sector, right, or e-commerce, you know how this can be, because you're like relying on predictable shipments. You're relying on the supply chain to actually work the way it's supposed to in order for you to get your products so you can actually ship them on time when you say. Just today, I got a shipment of shirts in, but a little bit different. I'm using a local stateside distributor, supplier for the shirts. So that supply chain isn't impacted the same way. I mean, it would be if there were some issues with trucks and all that stuff, but wasn't the case. So it was much easier to get my stuff. Was it more expensive? Yes. But was I able to get them quicker and I was guaranteed to get them? Yes. So there's pros and cons to it. That's hence the reason for plan A's, plan B's, plan C's, etc. Okay. Competitive disadvantages. So businesses that are unable to absorb or pass on increased costs might find it challenging to compete with larger companies that have more resources to manage tariff-related expenses. And this is where the rub comes in for small business owners, because there's typically not a large margin for somebody to be able to pay those higher prices. So they have to pass that on to the consumer. They have to pass that on to the person that's actually paying for it. And they don't have deep pockets to necessarily extend this thing out for a long duration of time. And so it becomes a disadvantage for the smaller company that does not have those deep pockets. So I want to talk about some strategies, though, for small business owners. If you're a business owner and you're wondering, what can you do to mitigate the effects of the tariffs that are taking place? Well, I kind of alluded to a couple already. And one of those is diversifying the suppliers. So unbeknownst to some, China is not the only supplier. They're not the only company that can get you, cost of goods at a lower cost than, what you're able to find stateside. There's lots of other places to do it. And so if you haven't searched into that, I highly suggest you start looking for alternative suppliers for these types of reasons and more. But exploring alternative options in countries that aren't going to be affected by tariffs. Okay. You can also negotiate with the existing suppliers. So just because the rates are getting hiked up because you're paying a little bit more on the back end, doesn't mean that you can't negotiate some kind of a better term, because they're being impacted by it as well. So if you are keeping the same supplier that's being impacted by this, you can have that conversation. You can negotiate and see what kind of terms you can come to, so that you're not necessarily absorbing all the costs, because they want the business too. So that's something that you could you can figure out if they're willing to share the burden for those increased prices. And then you can also adjust pricing strategies. Okay, so it's really important to evaluate like what you currently have as a pricing model, and then maybe incrementally increasing price adjustments to make it doable for not just yourself, but for customers without the big shock coming to pass. Anybody that's gone to the grocery store and you end up seeing, a carton of eggs at $33 a pop, it's like some shock factor there because you didn't see an incremental price increase. You just seen that baby just switch over on the drop of a dime. But you don't have to do it that way, right? Maybe you can take a hit for a month and you can incrementally change it and then adjust it, etc. So the other thing is enhancing operational efficiencies. So if you have internal processes that just aren't fine tuned yet, be a good time to reevaluate those to reduce waste, which can improve your ability to incur these costs. And so if you have more money being spent in other areas such as your marketing, let's say, your lead gen, etc., and that's inefficient because you got employees you're paying and man hours that are being racked up, and you don't have any automation behind that, for example, then that's a time to evaluate that, because if you did have automations in place for some of these processes, that's money you're saving there, which means you could afford to take the hit as far as the cost of goods is concerned. Okay. Could these tariffs present any opportunities for small businesses? Yeah, it could. And the other example that I was mentioning here about my own self and getting those shirts localized, it increases the demand for domestic products. And so, consumers and businesses, you may find alternative options to imported goods, and could potentially boost your sales for your small business for certain products that you offer if you find the right partner in place. And so it's also a opportunity to enter a market that's been previously dominated by foreign competitors because of the products becoming less expensive. So there's also opportunities to now step into a particular market if you were ever considering it. Now may be a time to do it. Innovation and differentiation. So as a small business owner, one of the big perks is that you have the ability to pivot often on the drop of a dime. You can move a lot quicker and more agile than a larger company can. So this is one of those areas that you can begin to consider, okay, what kind of innovative tactics or differentiation in your offerings can you create and come up with to meet consumer demands? There's not always a price differentiation that makes the deal, right? Sometimes it's the customer service. Sometimes it's the experience that you provide or the ease at which somebody is able to make a transaction and make a purchase. Those are other ways as well that you can innovate and differentiate yourself from somebody who's leaning primarily on a pricing strategy. Well, what about long-term considerations should small business owners keep in mind regarding international policies? So this is kind of a rude awakening for many because it was something that was knocking on the door for a while. We heard about this being spoken of even before elections took place, or it really ramped up around that time frame, right? But it's been months in the making where we've been hearing about tariffs and that they were going to be coming, etc. And so this wasn't something that just happened out of the blue. This has been something that's been being developed for quite some time. But a couple of things to consider here is policy volatility. Okay. We must recognize that the trade policies change with the administrations. And this administration was, banging on that drum for a minute that it was going to happen. And so you got to know when these things are potentially on the horizon and have a contingency plan in place so that you can adapt accordingly. Building resilience in the small business front, sometimes it is a war of attrition. You don't always like to say that, but sometimes there actually is, or at least a season of it. And those who can endure, they win. And so developing a flexible business model that can withstand supply chain disruptions is crucial for long-term success, for sustainability in the long term. And so, as mentioned earlier, some of that resiliency may be around pricing strategy. It may be around differentiation and innovation in a way that you haven't previously considered before. And so something to think about. And then advocacy and engagement. There's tons of groups out there, Chamber of Commerce type groups, etc., who their platforms for not just voicing concerns and looking at it from a lobbying front, but they're groups who are looking after each other in some way, shape, or form, right? They're either getting business referred to one another, they're giving you insights or strategies about what's working for them, And it's a really good opportunity for you to just begin to rub elbows with people that are thinking differently than you are. Because sometimes when you're in the thick of it, it's hard to think innovatively. It's hard to get creative and differentiate yourself by something super, super unique when all you can do is think about how tough it's going and how much it's hitting the wallet. And so those are things that you want to consider. Okay. And now we got a 30-day measure in place. So again, this is another reminder about that, because the question is, what long-term considerations should somebody consider or keep in mind? But now we got a short-term consideration in place, because there's a 30-day window right now, or a pause. And what should people be preparing for? Are these tariffs going to still come and you're going to be impacted by it? Well, again, scenario planning, right? You should consider different tariff outcomes to determine and develop a contingency plan. So start shopping around, for an alternative supplier. Start thinking domestically. Think about domestic partners, and maybe in the past, it wasn't doable for you to do because of cost, etc. But might be a different story now. Maybe you're able to consider it now because of the fact that something's going to be potentially changing. Are both of these sides of the border going to fulfill their duties? That's up in the air, and I don't know if you want to be able to put that up to chance and just hope and pray that somebody's going to actually fulfill on that. We already know that they didn't, hence the reason why we got here to begin with. And so I wouldn't be banking on the fact that Mexico is going to hold up on its end of the bargain, or Canada. Something could happen between now and then that says, hey, sorry, no deal. You guys weren't fulfilling your end of the bargain, so we're going to still hit you with the tariff, but it's going to be 20% instead of 25%. We just do not know. So supplier diversification, and consider local suppliers. There's tons of local suppliers here that, you could potentially source, and they're looking for business as well. They know they're going to be, that everybody's getting impacted by this potentially. And so negotiate, begin to discuss potential outcomes. And obviously, if you have a product line or a business that has a little bit more leverage because of the quantity and whatnot, then you might have some better terms than you think that you could deal with. All right. But what is this going to lead? So could this deal lead to long-term changes in North American trade relations? Well, many believe that we're looking at stronger North American economic ties. So if security cooperation proves effective, it may encourage further economic collaboration between three countries, right? Which personally, I think that's probably going to be the case. We've already heard about, Trump joking, if you want to call it. Maybe he's not even joking. Maybe he's serious, about Canada becoming the 51st state of the United States. Some people think it's a wonderful idea. Others think that that's a horrible idea and it's never going to happen. Trump says we don't need any of their products. Canadians may think otherwise. I don't know. There's so many different opinions on this, but what is going to happen in the long term? Who knows? We're going to find out. Come up with a contingency plan is all I got to say. Temporary solution or new precedent. So some think that these particular discussions are a short-term fix rather than a fundamental shift in trade policy. Could be the case because 4 years from now we're going to have a new administration in place. Who knows what's going to happen at that point in time? Point being that I want to leave you with here is basically to say that there are a lot of things taking shape with policy, economic changes that are taking shape as well within our monetary system. Who knows what's going to happen here in the next 12 months? So on the front with tariffs and how that impacts your business from a supply chain perspective, or if you're in a product type of business where you have to deal with suppliers and distributors, now's the time to get into a contingency plan. And I would advocate for you to get a contingency plan that strongly favors a a local supplier, because you're not going to necessarily be dealing with the same challenges. Is it going to cost you more? Yeah, but in the long term, it's going to save you some gray hairs. And so I would advocate for that. All right. And with that, we're going to check out. We're going to keep a pulse on other things that are happening in the world that are impacting business owners like yourselves, and see what we can bring to the table. Looking forward to any discussion here, and we will talk to you later. Have a good one.